The U.S. is nearing the finish line in talks to revive Obama's horrible nuclear deal with Iran. A rock star negotiator? Russia? Seriously? Jenn was asked about it today.
Why are we still having Putin's Russia broker the Iran nuclear deal talks?
Well, I would say that it's not in our interest for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and Russia is a member of the P5+1. So that is pursuit of a deal that would be in our national security interests.
Well, with Russia in charge, what could possibly go wrong, right, Mercy? Brian Leib, Executive Director of Iranian Americans for Liberty, joins us now. Brian, let's start there. What could go wrong?
Everything could go wrong if you have Russia in the driver's seat dictating diplomacy or dictating how our country should engage in diplomacy. Listen, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, they're all this new axis of power that's been formed, and they're all doing everything they can to work against the best interests of the American people. And honestly, I keep questioning, Joe Biden and asking myself, it really seems like he's not working in the best interests of the American people. If he was, he would say no to diplomacy with the Iranian regime. He would say no to Russia. He would say no to China. But unfortunately, it's all systems go, diplomacy with terrorists and dictatorship regimes.
Yeah, it makes no sense, I have to say. When you have a weak foreign policy here in the United States, it definitely allows the bullies to take some power and some control. But here you have the official U.S. position now is that Putin is a war criminal. And it took them a while to get there, don't get me wrong. But we have Russia that can still negotiate and then handle Iran's nuclear material. All the while, Iran's getting billions of dollars to help build nuclear sites within its country and fund their war machine and fund terrorists, as we know. Is this just going back to an Obama-era foreign policy / State Department mentality?
100%. This is Obama 2.0. Some of the very first hires that President Biden made were individuals like Wendy Sherman, Robert Malley, John Kerry. Stop me if you've heard some of these names before. Of course you have. They were all part of the Obama administration. And one of the biggest things that Biden promised the world from a foreign policy perspective is that he was going to do everything that he could to re-enter the JCPOA. The JCPOA was a bad deal from the start. During Obama's tenure, it gave the Iranian regime the runway that they needed to eventually build a nuclear weapon. And President Trump made a campaign promise that he would rip up the deeply flawed JCPOA, and that's exactly what he did. And Mercy, you just talked about the Iranian regime funding terrorist proxies all around the world. Your viewers might not know, but today is the 30th anniversary of a deadly bombing that was carried out in Argentina at Israel's embassy. It was carried out by Hezbollah, who receives almost every single cent of their funding from the IRGC. That was 30 years ago. So the Iranian regime, directly and indirectly through their terrorist proxies, have been funding these terrorist groups, have been funding murder and death all throughout the region. That was 30 years ago. They haven't changed their tune once. And here we are 30 years later, and Biden is doing everything he can to negotiate with these terrorists.
Well, Brian, in a flashback to better times in the U.S. and in the world, back in 2019, Secretary Pompeo, he made this announcement as part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Listen.
I am announcing our intent to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, including its Quds Force, as a foreign terrorist organization in accordance with Section 219 of the Immigration and Nationality Act.
So in another effort to undo everything that Trump accomplished, word is Biden may remove the Iranian Revolutionary Guard from the terror list. I mean, just days ago, the IRGC claimed responsibility for missile attacks that struck near the U.S. consulate in Erbil, Iraq. What's the justification for removing them from the terror list?
It doesn't really make a lot of sense to anyone that's looking at this situation. And as I just mentioned, 30 years ago, the IRGC funded Hezbollah. That was 30 years ago. So for 30 years, they've been funding these terrorist proxies all around the world. They are terrorists. And so are all the other terrorist groups that the IRGC has been funding for many, many years. Unfortunately, President Biden is doing everything he can, almost it seems like, to put more money into the Iranian regime's hands. And we know their track record is this. The money is not going to go to the infrastructure programs that we hope and think that it would. The money is going to go out the door funding terrorist proxies, and it's not going to do anything to help the Iranian people. So, yeah, the question has to continue to be asked, why President Biden is so interested in loosening every single sanction against the Iranian regime. And one final point about another terrorist proxy that the Iranians fund, and that's the Houthi rebels out of Yemen. The Houthis have been attacking our allies like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, for about a year and a half now. One of the first actions that President Biden and Secretary Blinken took was delisting the Houthis from the State Department's FTO list. That was a direct message to the Iranian regime that this was going to be a different sheriff in town. And the Iranian regime pushed more money out the door to the Houthis. The Houthis are they're attacking our allies. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE sent a letter to President Biden about 2 weeks ago begging him to put the Houthis back on the FTO list. And, of course, President Biden did not respond to that letter. And I think as we were talking about a week or so ago, we're not shocked that they didn't answer the phone when President Biden called.
Right. No question about it. Brian Leib, always appreciate your insight. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Have a good night.
You too. At this